He expected people quickly to accept his absorption of Ukraine. That is not happening, quite the reverse. The West is more united than it has ever been.
It does feel like the Prime Minister's got a rather large in-tray at the moment. I'm just wondering what's on the agenda this week at NATO and G7 meetings. What are the priorities that he's going to be focusing on?
They will all be international. So at the Commonwealth Summit, it was about sustainability, about development, about the expansion of the Commonwealth and certain internal matters in the Commonwealth, particularly the re-election of Baroness Scotland as Secretary General. At the G7, it will be the international energy crisis. It will be international inflation crisis, possibility of stagflation, and Ukraine. And Ukraine will be the theme that unites G7 and NATO summits. Where in Madrid, Ukraine will be absolutely the number one issue, and also the expansion of NATO.
Let's talk about Ukraine, because it's quite interesting, isn't it? Olaf Scholz, who is the German Chancellor chairing the G7 this year, saying the war in Ukraine mustn't stop the focus on climate responsibilities. And we know the backdrop of this, that Germany and France would be quite keen on getting some kind of peace deal in Ukraine, even if that means that Ukraine has to give up some of its territory. The likes of the UK are far less keen on that idea.
Chloe, I disagree with that. I do not think that either Germany or France will be overtly peddling the idea of an early surrender by Ukraine. I think all leaders will recommit to support Ukraine and respect Ukraine's war aims and the timetable that Ukraine sets itself. Clearly, there is interest in a peaceful solution, but not in a Ukrainian capitulation. And in the short term, that is all that is on offer.
It's interesting because there have been reports, haven't there, that France and Germany have said that, you know, if it means that this war doesn't drag on, then maybe Ukraine has to entertain the thought of maybe giving up the Donbass region. You simply don't believe those reports?
I think that in the summit, if they try that the Americans and the Brits, the Canadians, Japanese will resist that. But we will see. I think, although, as you say, these are reports, actually, when it comes down to it, observed behavior is that all the West has stood pretty solidly behind Zelensky and Ukraine. And we saw that very clearly last week when the EU offered candidate status to Ukraine way earlier than an economic assessment would have justified.
Now, when it comes to NATO, it's been very much, well, historically and even more so now, treading a very fine line between NATO supporting one another and welcoming new countries in. Finland and Sweden, we know, want to join, but also not wanting to antagonise Russia.
That is right, but there is a very clear red line for NATO, and that is the border of NATO. So a key difference between Ukraine and the Baltic states from the get-go has been the fact that the Baltic states are full members of NATO. And the fact that there are NATO troops across the Baltic states, including British troops, is a very clear signal to Russia. And this protection is going to be expanded to Finland and Sweden. I do not expect Finland and Sweden actually to join this week. The Turkish problems, I think, are real. The applications were only received last month, so I don't think it's particularly unusual that they need two goes at this. But sometime in the next year or so, both Finland and Sweden will join.
And what do you think the fallout of that will be?
I think that it's a very clear piece of evidence that things are not going according to plan internationally for Mr. Putin, that he expected the West to be divided after his invasion of Ukraine. He expected people quickly to accept his absorption of Ukraine. That is not happening, quite the reverse. The West is more united than it has ever been. And indeed, key institutions which he dislikes are getting bigger.
I wanted to ask you that, if you feel that NATO and G7 countries have actually become closer, more unified, if you like, since Russia invaded Ukraine?
Yes, especially NATO. It's only a couple of years ago since President Macron said that NATO was brain dead. Now he is a clear supporter of NATO. He talks less these days of European strategic autonomy because Europe by itself cannot manage all aspects of its own defense. NATO is still an organization to which the United States makes by far the biggest individual contribution, about 40%. So this crisis has brought all parts of NATO closer together, and NATO feels its purpose in a way that hasn't been the case since the end of the Cold War.
And if we step outside of Europe and indeed the West, there are countries in the world that really just see the war in Ukraine as a European problem, not always viewing Russia as the aggressor, but feeling that NATO has been quite aggressive towards Russia. How does that fall out? What is the fallout for that for British diplomacy around the world?
Well, Chloe, I would dispute the characterization of countries beyond Europe seeing NATO as the aggressor. There is some dispute about whether European policies opening up to the East were a sort of provocation. But as time goes by and Russia relies ever less on the idea that they were preventing an expansion of NATO, they are talking very much more openly about re-establishing Russia's sphere of influence, indeed even imperium. I think who is to blame is much more widely accepted as Russia, but the consequences are absolutely disputed. You are right about that. There's other countries see it as a European problem that is affecting them, especially their food supplies, and they are looking to Europe to get them out of that. So there is a big diplomatic effort to make sure that the rest of the world understands what is really going on and understands why grain supplies aren't getting through. This clearly hasn't succeeded, but in the key votes, particularly in the United Nations, the West is doing better than Russia.
Perhaps I should have used the word antagonise when people, some countries around the world feel that NATO has antagonised Russia and provoked a response.
That's fair, Chloe, but antagonise resulting in an invasion which kills tens of thousands of people. I think all countries see that the Russian reaction is no way justified by previous Western behaviour.
Let's talk. You talk about grain supplies there. Food security is one of the things on the agenda at the G7. Just explain to people who don't follow the G7 closely, don't follow NATO meetings closely. There's a lot of talk. Is it anything more than a talking shop? How much is actually achieved? They go in with these high hopes and wanting to achieve things. How much is actually achieved on the other side?
It depends very much year to year. It depends on what is on the agenda. Yes, the G7 can be a talking shop. If I may say, when Russia was a member, when it was the G8, it was especially a talking shop because the difference between Russia's approach and everybody else's was so great that they were unable to agree very much. But since Russia was kicked out, there is greater cohesion. And since the invasion of Ukraine, there is a clear need for this group of people to work together. So I think that this year's summit in Bavaria will be particularly purposeful. And I think that there will be results that everybody can see and whose effects all countries, including Russia, will be aware of.
Very good to speak to you this morning. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Chloe.
That is Lord Simon McDonald. He's a crossbench peer and former permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.